Father Divine and Kwame Nkrumah. Today we'll take a rather deep dive into the available sources that demonstrate not only personal contact between Kwame Nkrumah and Father Divine when Kwame Nkrumah was a resident student in the United States, but also a persistent influence, philosophically and politically, exercised by Father Divine on Kwame Nkrumah and the subsequent pan-Africanist movement. These sources include a brief 8mm film taken by a member of the Peace Mission of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's appearance in Philadelphia in 1958, at which Father Divine's Rosebud Choir performed. This is historic footage. Another source is an office interview between Father Divine and the Reverend Leon Sullivan planning this event, and a testimony from a Ghanaian member of Dr. Prime Minister Nkrumah's entourage, testifying to the inspiration and importance of Father Divine's peace mission in the life and mission of Kwame Nkrumah. Controversial in some quarters, Kwame Nkrumah is a world historical figure who is a heroic inspiration to millions and millions of others. Whether a man of virtues or of flaws, God was able to reach him and to use him in profound ways. We will also look at excerpts from Ahmad Rahman's Regime Change book about Kwame Nkrumah as it applies to Father Divine. Rahman is one of the few academics who has written in any depth in English about the connection between Kwame Nkrumah and Father Divine, and he highlights the importance or even centrality of that connection to Kwame Nkrumah's goals, methods, and tactics. The contact with Dr. Nkrumah is another example of how Father Divine almost invisibly influenced the world in very profound ways, behind the scenes, without taking credit, again and again. Regardless of what was ultimately made of this contact personally, the ramifications of it continue and will continue to reverberate for generations. Kwame Nkrumah is a figure of world historical importance who did have personal contact with Father Divine, who ate at Father Divine's tables and sometimes slept under Father Divine's roofs. He was no doubt influenced toward pan-Africanism by Father's teachings regarding political unification. Rahman's thesis is that Father Divine was the archetypal model, the mythical elder sage to the young Nkrumah. He was a primary influence regarding liberation, racial equality, national unity, and international federalism. Father Divine's economics, more than Marx, was the prototype for Nkrumah's tactic of positive action and accounts for many of Nkrumah's divergences from Marxist orthodoxy. Like Father Divine, Kwame Nkrumah also married interracially. There will be several names in this presentation derived from African languages that are difficult for me to pronounce. I apologize in advance when I garble those names. I'm trying the best I can with those, and the text will be on the screen so that the spelling will be there. Also, you will hear me say W and N when racial terms of the time period are used in the texts that we refer to. W, B, N. This is peace mission practice to avoid using racializing language or terms wherever possible. It helps spiritually flag those terms in consciousness so that at least we are not using them uncritically or unthinkingly. Father's goal is to ultimately eradicate racial consciousness from the minds and hearts of humanity as it marches toward union, and Kwame Nkrumah is one of the resonant influences, one of the butterfly effects of Father Divine's work that went out into the world and had tremendous repercussions. Two paragraphs from Wikipedia as accessed on the 15th of November, 2024. Francis Kwame Nkrumah, 21st of September 1909 to 27th of April 1972, was a Ghanaian politician, political theorist, and revolutionary. He served as Prime Minister of the Gold Coast from 1952 until 1957, when it gained independence from Britain. He was then the first Prime Minister and then the President of Ghana from 1957 until 1966. An influential advocate of pan-Africanism, Nkrumah was a founding member of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, and winner of the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet Union in 1962. After multiple failed attempts on his life, coupled with increasingly difficult local economic conditions, Nkrumah's government became authoritarian, in the eyes of its critics, in the 1960s as he repressed political opposition and conducted elections that were not free and fair, again in the eyes of critics. In 1964, a constitutional amendment made Ghana a one-party state with Nkrumah as president for life of both the nation and its party. Nkrumah was deposed in 1966 in a coup d'etat by the National Liberation Council, under whose supervision the country's economy was privatized. Nkrumah lived the rest of his life in Guinea, where he was named honorary co-president. I should say that these critical comments in the second paragraph are highly debatable, because what had taken place was an independence revolution, and that was immediately met with the resistance of colonial economic powers and by the fact that Ghana became one more small country pawn in the Cold War, in the international tensions between Soviet Russia and capitalist United States. So it was in that context that Nkrumah was acting to preserve the revolution that had been achieved against outside influences and against regressive internal influences that would restore colonial exploitation or that would reduce Ghana to a pawn for one of the superpowers. So that has to be considered in weighing the kinds of claims that are made there in the second paragraph. But they say after the revolution, the revolutionary becomes a conservative because he or she must then preserve the revolutionary gains, and there will be many counter-revolutionary forces within and without rising to challenge the new order. Kwame Nkrumah became the father or grandfather of pan-Africanism. Father Divine had been one of the earliest voices calling for pan-American unification, at least one of the earliest United States voices to call for the political unification of the three Americas and all the countries therein. Father Divine says, "At this particular cycle of time and at this time of world crises as you see and know them, I feel that nothing is more important to the peace and security of our Western Hemisphere and even to the peace of the world at large than the proposal I have advanced to President Roosevelt and the heads of the 21 American republics for the unification of all the Americas. I wired this proposal to President Roosevelt December the 9th, 1939 as follows. Peace. Why not unite the three Americas as a national and international defense for peace? Let there be the United Countries of America, even as this is the United States of America. If not, I propose that the United States purchase Central and South America and make all the Americas one democracy. As a humane worker, I appeal to this country, the United States of America, and to all of the 21 republics of Central and South America to unify together. This will be your real national and international defense." 28th of December, 1939, ADFD. And here we see a cover of The New Day bearing the headline, "Solution to Present Inter-American Situation Given in 1939. Let there be the United Countries of America." Father Divine. God Almighty Father Divine has said it, and someday it will be. The Americas will be one nation and one people marching toward a unified humanity with a federalized globe. In this brief clip, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Prime Minister of Ghana, at the All-African Peoples Conference he convened in Accra, December 1958, calls for a United States of Africa.
This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
Here we see a little bit of evidence of Father Divine's advocacy of international union, or subsuming nationalism into internationalism. We see 4 peace stamps, a Unity is the Way badge, and a wall poster, Abolish Tariffs and Immigration Barriers. The first peace stamp, Father says, peace, one nation, one language, one flag, one speech. Telegrams to President Roosevelt, Vice President Garner, and U.S. Senate, Honorable Bankhead, House of Representatives, Secretary of State Hull, and Secretary of War Woodring, December the 9th, 1939, ADFD. Why not unite the 3 Americas as national and international defense for peace? Let there be the United Countries of America, even as this is the United States of America. If not, propose that the United States purchase Central and South America and make all the Americas one democracy. Father Divine. Beneath that, for a just and lasting peace, why not propose at the International Conference of Nations the unification of all the mutual and allied sovereignties of the universe, and let the United Countries of the world be one big, universal, allied sovereignty? By the unity of the spirit, mind, aim, and of purpose, let all of the allied sovereignties unite consolidatedly, and the 4 freedoms will be made a reality. July the 6th, 1944, ADFD, Father Divine. In the upper right, unify, unify, unify. Peace, May 6th, 1950, ADFD. I propose that Australia, New Zealand, and America unite as one great nation, having the U.S. Constitution, Declaration of Independence, and Bill of Rights as a means of national and international defense for peace and in fulfillment of the Scripture. Genesis 11 and 6. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Reverend M.J. Divine, M.S.D., D.D., better known as Father Divine. This one has less of a geographical focus and more of a linguistic focus as a potential basis for world unification. To English schoolgirl. By intuition and by scientific geographic inspiration, I am moving in all nations, and I am bringing all people together. I have broken that line of demarcation, but it is only being shown gradually in the present different demonstrations. Reverend M.J. Divine, M.S.D., D.D., better known as Father Divine. Regarding the last red peace stamp, traditional prince and later president of Botswana, Seretse Khama, married Ruth Williams, later Lady Khama, in 1948. The interracial and post-colonial marriage caused great controversy internationally. Schoolgirl, in headlines of the time, was probably meant to stir added controversy and to suggest illegitimate difference in ages. In reality, he was 26 and she was 24. Father said, specifically and very clearly, that this marriage was evidence of his work unfolding slowly by degrees in the greater world, and found it important enough to draw attention to it in a peace stamp, which would have been affixed to many, many outgoing letters of correspondence from Father Divine and members of the peace mission. Over the years, there were only 16 peace stamps issued, so it's rare that any issue would be of such great importance that it would be flagged in that particular way. And here a headline and colophon from the New Day. Unification will solve your every problem by the Spirit of the presence of God. Father Divine. and a colophon that appeared as space filler frequently in the New Day at a certain period in time. Unite the three Americas, for in union there is strength. Father Divine emphasized American identity for those born and living here, regardless of their so-called race, creed, or color. He did not endorse any such thing as a Back to Africa movement or any effort to separate out types of Americans for discrimination or relocation. Father says, I am not thinking about telling anyone to go to Africa at Bilbo's wishes or command. Bilbo was a racist senator of the time. Quote, and I am not thinking of trying to get the Jewish people to go to Palestine. Look what they are doing to the Jews in Palestine already, and look what the Jews are supposed to be doing to them, and look how they are carrying on. The British occupancy of Palestine, whether it would be the British occupancy of Palestine or the American occupancy of Palestine, it would make no difference to me if it meant to segregate and separate and discriminate. I would not endorse it, neither would I tolerate it or sympathize with it. Because evidence shows daily in these borders what they would do to those of the underprivileged and non-privileged, and what would be done to them generally by those of the overprivileged and all-privileged. Father Divine, February 1947 A.D. F.D. For Father Divine and his followers, the age of nationalism is over, and the age of international union has begun. That which does not tend to unify will tend to its own isolation and extinction. I do believe that regardless of how spiritual Dr. Nkrumah was personally, or how conscious he was of Father Divine's deity and influence, I believe nonetheless that Father Divine is the catalyst who inspired the great pan-African spirit to awaken in Dr. Nkrumah, to be carried back to the African continent, to grow and grow. And truly, that story, like the story of pan-Americanism, has only just begun. Let's go now and spend considerable time with our primary source, in which Dr. Leon Sullivan comes to Father Divine's office for an interview about sending the Rosebuds or some other peace mission delegation to an event being organized to honor Dr. Kwame Nkrumah on his first diplomatic visit to the United States. Interview granted by Father Divine to Reverend Leon Sullivan, pastor of Zion Baptist Church, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on the subject of a demonstration of unity with Prime Minister of Ghana, Africa, as guest. In Father's private office study of the Circle Mission Church Home and Training School, Incorporated, 764 to 772 Broad Street, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Monday evening, July 21st, 1958, ADFD, time 10:50 p.m. Published in The New Day, August 2nd, 1958, ADFD, beginning on page 10. The Secretary speaks firstly as follows. Father Divine, Reverend Leon M. Sullivan. Father says, Peace, Reverend. Reverend Sullivan. Peace, Father. My, you look fine. You look wonderful. Father. Thank you. And how are you? Reverend Sullivan. I have been working pretty hard. I certainly appreciate the wonderful, wonderful story that appeared in the New Day regarding my church about a month ago. My, you just look fine and working the same as the last time I saw you. I think it's wonderful. At this point, Mother Divine enters the office and says, Peace, Reverend Sullivan. Reverend Sullivan, rising and bowing, Peace. Mother, nice to see you here. Reverend Sullivan, thank you for seeing me. I didn't expect that I would have the privilege of seeing the two of you tonight. I was telling Father I appreciate the wonderful story that was in the New Day about my church. Mother, yes. Reverend Sullivan, we got sponsors from all over. Father, that's wonderful. Reverend Sullivan, the people appreciate it very much. We got a pile of papers there at the church, New Days, but they didn't last long. I thought it was very gracious of you to write about it. Mother, yes. Reverend Sullivan, I was telling Father it is wonderful the way he works. Mother, with a smile, why not? Reverend Sullivan, he works the same way he did the last time I saw him. Father, we are always glad to see you, Reverend. Glad to have you come and dine with us because that is a part of my mission and work to feed the people. Glad to have you come and dine with us because that is a part of my mission and work to feed the people. Reverend Sullivan, that is wonderful. My wife and I often speak of it. Mother, how are things with you? Reverend Sullivan, I was telling Father things are very well. I have no complaints. I have been very, very fortunate beyond my own abilities, and I appreciate it. Do you do much traveling personally, Father? Father, I don't do so much traveling personally, only locally. Reverend Sullivan, I remember the beautiful castle at Woodmont several years ago. One of these days, perhaps, Father, you will be able to come and see my place. Father, yes, I would be glad to whenever it is convenient for yourself and also me. Mother, is there any particular day, Reverend Sullivan, that you are there? Reverend Sullivan, at my church, every Sunday. I don't know whether Father personally is in town Sundays, though. Father, well, I am at times. Secretary, we were out at Woodmont yesterday. Father entertained many guests there and served Holy Communion service. Reverend Sullivan and Father converse a little concerning a written invitation being extended, Father. Then Reverend Sullivan says, You know, Father, you are a mystery to the people. Father, with a smile, Thank you. Reverend Sullivan, but Father, you know, it is amazing the tremendous regard the people have for you and your work. Father, thank you. Reverend Sullivan, I am out there a great deal. I don't guess my church is a small one now. I guess it might be considered a pretty big church. And I meet a lot of people, and it is wonderful the incalculable regard that people have for your work, and I consider it an honor to be personally acquainted with you, and I mean that sincerely. I consider it an honor when I talk to people sometimes to be able to convey the spirit of what I have said to you. Father, sure. Reverend Sullivan, Mother, do you and Father ever go visiting? Mother, in what way do you mean? Reverend Sullivan, well, like I visited your home at Woodmont. Do you ever go visiting homes? Mother, well, it depends if the Spirit calls Father to an individual's home. He does not make it a practice. Reverend Sullivan, I understand. Well, I don't want to take too much of your time. To the Secretary, should I mention the other? Secretary, yes, if you wish. Reverend Sullivan, to Father, well, I called because of a gentleman. You know him. Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana in Africa. Father, yes. Reverend Sullivan, he is the Prime Minister of the new republic in Africa, and he is a symbol of democracy and freedom in Africa. He is coming to visit with President Eisenhower this week. Father, I see. Reverend Sullivan, and he will be coming to Philadelphia. He will be in America for 10 days, and he will be coming to Philadelphia this Saturday. He will be in Philadelphia for about 3 hours, and he will be coming to Independence Hall, where he will lay a wreath on the Liberty Bell. Then he will be coming to the National Philatelic Museum at the southeast corner of Broad and Diamond. There is where he will observe the stamp collection, there because of his interest in stamps, being the head of the Republic. From there he will go to the University of Pennsylvania, where he will receive a medal because he once went to school there. Then I think he will go to the City Museum and then on to New York. I have been asked by the Philatelic Museum to have a mass demonstration, more to foster than anything else Afro-American unity. This is my own description because I believe, and I know you believe, Father, that somehow those segments, those divisions, must reach a point of resolvement. Now there is no difference, but in my mind no one has indicated this in terms of practicality better than you anywhere in the world. This I have said publicly as well as privately. The people in Philadelphia know the regard I have for you. It is not something that I say here. I say it wherever I go. I was asked this about a week ago to head this committee. Temple University is cooperating with us, Boy Scout and Girl Scout groups in the city. We have about 100 committee groups that I hope will, before Saturday, and I know they will, circularize their blocks in this area in order to alert the people to know what is happening to the idea that we might get the people there. We are operating on a clear across-the-board basis where a great deal of emphasis is placed upon congested areas and beyond that because I want a demonstration of Afro-American unity. Now, I have been a little concerned about how successful it is going to be, as I was the last time when we were having a demonstration concerning juvenile delinquency, and it did a whole lot to bring juvenile delinquency to the attention of Philadelphia. I was concerned before I started this organization, and I came to you and asked your assistance and your endorsement and support, and you did that. And I think I mentioned it at Rayburn Plaza. You had endorsed it. And I am a little bit concerned about this. I want it to succeed for no personal reason, but for the cause. Now, of course, my church, the church I serve, will support me pretty strongly. I will have the support, I believe, of the youth groups and of most organizations. But I would not be satisfied in my own mind had I not come here and asked for your endorsement and to ask if it is possible on Saturday afternoon that those of your followers who might be free at that time and might be interested, if it is possible if they could come where this demonstration will be. It will not be a long one. It will start at 4 o'clock and be over at 5. The demonstration will consist of this: from 4 to 4:30, African groups, young men and young women who are here from Africa studying, will put on African displays. There will be African music and that kind of thing the last half hour, from 4:30 to 5, because the Prime Minister will be there at 5 o'clock. Then we will have a few brief demonstrations of people who will point up the value of Afro-American relationship. When Prime Minister Nkrumah comes, we will welcome him and ask him to say a few words, and then we will dismiss the meeting. The idea being the more people we can assemble in the demonstration of Afro-American unity, the better it will be not only for Philadelphia, but for the country and for the world, particularly as strained as relationships are between the Far East and Middle East. And Africa is quite disturbed, seriously disturbed, as to what part America would have to play in the whole conflict. It seems to be better to build bridges now across the waters if we can, and for that reason I suppose the President is asking that the Prime Minister would come and that he come to Philadelphia, the cradle of democracy, to see a small demonstration. I have been asked to be chairman. I don't want to be. I try not to get involved in these committee things, but somehow I get involved in them. Mother, Reverend Sullivan, on that Afro-American demonstration, you want to see an integrated demonstration. Reverend Sullivan, that's right. I want to see persons who are other than those called Afro. Now I am sure we will have a strong group of dark-complexioned people. We will have many light-complexioned people because the Philatelic Museum has sent out announcements to 150,000 of their subscribers. 500, I anticipate, will come. So even a sprinkling, as long as it is not solidly dark-complected people, so it won't be all mass dark. A sprinkling only requires 100 or 200. If I only had a sprinkling of 100 or so, it would mean a lot in terms of, Merriment resounds. Then Reverend Sullivan says, all races, creeds, and colors are welcome. So any persons from the movement who might be free, who might be called upon, would help. Even though it would be only 25 or 50 or 75, it would help a lot. I just want to ensure, that it's a strange thing how some people want things like this to fail. Some people get ideas that people are involved in things for ulterior motives, and for that reason I have tried to stay as far as possible out of these committee commitments because I have no axes to grind. No chestnuts to pull out of the fire. It is simply that I believe in some things. The Spirit urges that I become involved in some things, but there are a lot of people who will want to see it fail for a lot of reasons. So that has been on my mind. I don't like to see things fail. Mother, that certainly is Father's mind and spirit of how you want to present America. Secretary, I remember when you came to Pine Brook, Reverend Sullivan, and asked Father's blessings, and he blessed you. I believe you were living in Orange, New Jersey at that time. Reverend Sullivan, yes, I am from West Virginia. That was in 1943. Of course, I went to New York. That was before I started working with Adam Powell. I was assistant minister. Before I started working, I was going to school. I did not have much money, so you fed me many times, Father. I suppose that many of us have taken advantage of your hospitality. Father, so glad. And I am glad to know that I may not have personally known you or your whereabouts at that time, for my work is for all humanity's sake universally. Therefore, when it comes to a point of view that we can help anyone, we are glad to do so from every point of view, without any, as you said a little while ago, without any axes to grind. Reverend Sullivan, you really don't have to grind axes if your motives are right. Father, no. Reverend Sullivan, if your motives aren't right, I suppose you run into all sorts or kinds of involvements that you can't supersede. But if your motives are right, somehow you will succeed. Father, when did you say this demonstration will take place? Reverend Sullivan, July the 26th. At this juncture, more discussing of the program takes place, Reverend Sullivan presenting Father with a written letter requesting his cooperation with regard to same. Secretary, I think Reverend Sullivan wanted permission to mention your name publicly in connection with the demonstration, Father. Father, why certainly. Reverend Sullivan, thank you very much. It will be handled well. And Father, you will never have to have any concern about me doing anything maliciously or infringing on what you would want done, nor will I permit anyone else to do it in my presence. Father, it is wonderful. Mother, perhaps I am being a little presumptuous, Father, but I was thinking that if Reverend Sullivan might need a little fill-in on the program, that the Rosebuds might be able to sing a nice song about Americanism. Reverend Sullivan, enthusiastically, it would be wonderful, it would be wonderful. Mother, at least it would put the point across if we enact the bill perfectly in the group. Reverend Sullivan, it would be wonderful. Mother, they are always ready when it comes to presenting Americanism when it is to be presented, because that is what we live in. Father, democracy and brotherhood. Reverend Sullivan, it would be wonderful. I would be very, very delighted. That would happen, if it were possible, at about 25 minutes to 5. I would like very much to have them on the program so that I could fit that in very well. Father, yes. Reverend Sullivan, I think it would be wonderful for them to sing a number in terms of the occasion. Mother, surely, whatever would be suitable for the occasion. Father says Americanism, brotherhood, democracy. Father, how is the family, Reverend? Reverend Sullivan, fine, my wife is fine. Father, seemed like you had children? Reverend Sullivan, no, Father, I haven't any children. Father, picking up Reverend Sullivan's letter, this is your letterhead, isn't it? Reverend Sullivan, that's right. Father, it is beautiful. Reverend Sullivan, I have a very, very fine congregation. They've been very good to me. I feel very fortunate. They have supported me, and everything is fine. I have no complaint. Secretary, is this demonstration going to be televised? Reverend Sullivan, no, it will be covered all right, but I doubt if it will be televised. I hope the demonstration is strong enough, though, for the television stations to receive different shots by presentation. As Reverend Sullivan looks toward Mother Divine questioningly, she says to Father, I guess Reverend Sullivan feels he has taken up enough of your time, Father. Father, graciously, it's perfectly all right. Reverend Sullivan, it's late. Do you stay up late? Father, smiling, well, it depends on what I have to do. Of course, I do stay up late at times, and at times I do not. But as aforesaid, I have meetings locally at different places. We hold meetings quite late here and elsewhere at other places. Reverend Sullivan, it's a crucial problem. It is all a matter of darker and lighter assembling together. My wife and I now live in a community called Greenbelt Knoll. It was built, or rather started, about 2 years ago. Our house was completed last year. It's a project where there are 19 families, 19 homes, and I think 7 of them are dark and 12 of them are light. Mother, that's nice. Secretary, yes, I read about that project in Eleanor Roosevelt's column the other day. Reverend Sullivan, yes, that's right. Secretary, she conveyed the thought that more of this type of thing should be done, and that she was waiting for an announcement of apartment houses in New York to be built on an open occupancy basis, for she would like to live in one. Reverend Sullivan, we're going to have to do more so. We seriously need it in Philadelphia and across the country. I know they had a great deal of difficulty persuading light-complexion Americans even, because they moved out. I suppose that this is the thing. People talk a lot, but when they come to a demonstration, It presents a problem, and it is a crucial matter and a crisis. And so you see the reason I would like to see this thing go off in a tremendous way, because the fate, I feel, of America, whether it remains a first-class or a second-class power, depends on whether or not we can resolve these differences. I have a friend who is an NBC correspondent in Moscow. I was with him 2 or 3 years ago in the Middle West, and he said that the most important thing in the minds of the people across the world is perhaps whether or not democracy is being practiced, as I think is evident here. Mother, that is what Father has been telling us for years. Reverend Sullivan, yes, and Father has run into many problems, too. There are a lot of people who don't want to see it. Now he is stabilized and he has no problems. I guess he has problems, too, now that it has to be demonstrated on a broad basis. It is difficult, it is hard out there. Eleanor Roosevelt, as was mentioned, was right about it. Especially people of the stature of Mrs. Roosevelt, they recognize that all people can be very small with their prejudices. There are a good many questions about how this movement could sustain itself, and no question about it, it is something unusual. It took something for this to happen. Since having a part of the movement, I have wondered, turning to the staff, I suppose some of you came with native prejudices you had before. Secretary, naturally so. Father, of course it is a great change taking place through the work of the Spirit by being converted out of that Adamic state of consciousness. And of course now naturally every true follower who comes into this recognition, he or she becomes to be a partaker of the Christ consciousness and is no longer subject to the preconceived prejudices and divisions that they were born with. And as they realize what does come by being made new creatures, and they become to be partakers of the great contagion, they too drop off those preconceived prejudices and refuse to indulge in them, fast them out of their system by refusing to compromise with them. We are happy to say it is true. At this point, Father excuses himself to answer the telephone, and Mother says, "So, by that, it is a great work of the Spirit." Reverend Sullivan, there is no question in my mind but that somehow we have to work out this problem. I know, of course, things eventuate in terms of or on the basis of what is done in a small way, and it has caused me a great deal of concern. Mother, the reality of the brotherhood of man will be brought about through the conviction of the fatherhood of God to all people. Reverend Sullivan, yes. At this juncture, as Reverend Sullivan prepares to go, the demonstration is again mentioned, and Mother says, "Well, Reverend Sullivan, I feel this way. When you appreciate Father and stand for the principle he stands for, the Spirit goes ahead and works things out for you. Since you are standing with Father, I know the Spirit is not going to allow it to be anything but a success." Reverend Sullivan, gratefully, "Thank you very much. Thank you very much." Mother, just so you stand with Father, that is the thing. And as you say, not be ashamed to say, wherever you go, what you would say to Father personally, in person, of his work. That is my conviction as to why you have been so wonderfully blessed. You have been honest with Father. Reverend Sullivan, I try to be honest. The only thing we can get out of life is by being honest. Mother, you just thank him to take over the situation and put it in his hands. The Spirit will take care of it for you. Reverend Sullivan, thank you very much. I enjoyed being here. Mother, I am so happy that you got to speak with Father. Reverend Sullivan, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mother, peace, and as Father would say, many blessings. Reverend Sullivan, peace. Here we have never-before-published video footage taken by an amateur peace mission videographer on the day of Prime Minister Nkrumah's Philadelphia appearance. Father Divine's International Rosebud Choir attends Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah's speech, Philadelphia, 26th of July, 1958, ADFD. Here we see various contingencies outside the Philadelphia Philatelic Society and various speakers on stage awaiting the arrival of Prime Minister Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. There on stage is a young Reverend Leon Sullivan. There are Prince Hall Masons with their Masonic aprons and regalia. Also a strong presence from the Islamic community apparent in the crowd and on the dais. This was a much bigger event than anyone anticipated. 15,000 to 20,000 people attended, and streets had to be closed off for several blocks. There are the Rosebuds. There are Father Divine's Rosebuds. Quite a few. It looks like at least 24 have turned out to sing their patriotic and integrationist songs. I don't recognize every speaker. This video, which has never been shared publicly before, is a historically important record of that day. This video was taken by a peace mission amateur videographer. I would say it's historically important. I don't have the technology to stabilize the image, but you can see that it's clear. And the original has no audio. It looks like the audience is very international. Here are the Rosebuds, and the songs they chose to do that day have gestures accompanying them. So you see them taking one another's hands periodically, saluting. You see they are matched in integrated pairs when they are taking hands. I don't know any other political figure for whom Father Divine sent out the Rosebuds personally. They went out sometimes to speak or sing at public events, but not for individual political personalities. So this was an extraordinary exception. Here, of course, Prime Minister Dr. Kwame Nkrumah has arrived in a limousine in his traditional attire and mounts the stage. Looks like a very enthusiastic reception. There certainly is something distinctive about Nkrumah's presence. Seems to be a numen on him, a blessing, a gift, a charism. He shines. In the week following, the New Day carried these two photographs of the event at which Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Prime Minister of Ghana, spoke. On the left, we see Prime Minister Nkrumah arriving. Ghana's Prime Minister visits the country seat of the world, as Father has dubbed Philadelphia. Caption: Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, Prime Minister of Ghana, appearing at the National Philatelic Museum, Broad and Diamond Streets last week, where he opened an exhibit of his country's postage stamps. He is wearing the official robe of his country. Confetti thrown from enthusiastic participants at the rally, held in his honor, covers his head and shoulders. And to the right we see the International Rosebud Choir performing at the speech venue. Members of Father Divine's International Interracial Rosebud Choir present a colorful and inspiring welcome in outdoor demonstration greeting Ghana's Prime Minister. They sang their patriotic songs, "Every Day is Brotherhood Day," and "I Am a Real True American." Reverend Dr. Leon Sullivan was an American and international civil rights leader who was born in West Virginia and spent most of his professional life in Philadelphia. Like many other ministers of many different denominations over the years, Dr. Sullivan sought the advice, endorsement, or cooperation of Father Divine. Because of concern about Philadelphia issues in particular, he often visited Father Divine and maintained respect and strong, cordial contact with the Peace Mission throughout his life. Dr. Sullivan's personal secretary for decades was a follower of Father Divine. She remains a living member of the Rosebuds and a resident of Circle Mission, and she was part of his office crew when traveling nationally and internationally for civil rights advocacy. Other followers were also employed by Sullivan's offices over the years. The image to the left here is an autographed copy of Dr. Sullivan's retirement program in 1988 ADFD, inscribed to Father Divine's office, "My brothers and sisters, love always." That eventful day exceeded anyone's expectations, as described in the dissertation Ghana at 50, a review of Ghana's official history through postage stamps, by Abinyega Adedzi, Illinois State University, 2008, pages 12 and 13. Adedzi writes, "Perhaps Ghana's philatelic agency's crowning public relations coup was achieved during Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's official visit in 1958 to the United States at the invitation of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dr. Nkrumah presented President Eisenhower with a special album containing blocks of 4 of the recent Ghana Airways series and the set of 4 stamps overprinted to commemorate his visit to the United States and Canada. Manfred Lehman also arranged for Dr. Nkrumah to visit on July 26, 1958, the National Philatelic Museum in Philadelphia, where he mounted a Ghana exhibit of Gold Coast and Ghana stamps, covers, photographs, and handicrafts. Lynn's weekly stamp news reporter, Ernest A. Kerr, referred to the event as 15 minutes of bedlam, pandemonium, and turmoil. Originally, the plan was to have a reception for 150 people in the museum at 4 p.m., but by 3 p.m. the police had to block the streets for several blocks as the crowd was estimated to be between 15 and 20,000. We see, however, from the historic film that we have just shown, that the crowd was anything but bedlam, pandemonium, and turmoil. It was quite composed. Kerr reported the presence of local Masonic Lodge members in silk toppers, church groups in West African costumes, bands, and even Philadelphia in Muslims. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that as the party then moved to the National Philatelic Museum at 2043 North Broad Street, where Dr. Nkrumah opened an exhibit on Ghana postage stamps, it was here that he was given an ear-splitting reception from more than 6,000 well-wishers who blocked traffic on Broad Street and Diamond Street, where they clamored to get close to the Prime Minister." End quote. It was a befitting recognition for Dr. Nkrumah, whose visit was viewed as the homecoming of a favorite son. Dr. Nkrumah obtained his higher degrees from Lincoln University and the University of Philadelphia. One of the few academic books that acknowledges the connection between Father Divine and Kwame Nkrumah is The Regime Change of Kwame Nkrumah, Epic Heroism in Africa and the Diaspora by Ahmad A. Rahman. I will read some excerpts from this book. He has about a chapter or half a chapter's worth of information and analysis about Father Divine and the role of Father Divine in shaping the ideas of Kwame Nkrumah. Rahman does not accept the deity of Father Divine, and some passages would be offensive to followers. I am going to leave those out of the analysis and commentary here today. The thesis of this book is that Kwame Nkrumah was a spiritually sensitive person who was aware of the role of religion and sacred story and archetype, mythic archetype, in the culture of Ghanaian people, and that he used this, as he believed Father used Christianity, to shape a political resistance. Now, it's very difficult to tell how much Kwame Nkrumah honored and respected Father Divine because his historical and political role would have necessitated that he distance himself from any such influence. So it is possible that he was someone from the outside who looked at Father Divine and said, there is a successful model, I want to imitate that as much as I can. It is also possible that he, who was presumably a believing Christian when he was studying theology in the United States, looked at Father Divine and took some sort of religious, spiritual inspiration. It's also possible that Father gave him some sort of transmission that made his life's work and mission possible, that opened the way for him, or that planted seeds in him that came to flourish later, whether he, Dr. Nkrumah, knew it or not. Those ripples, that butterfly effect, Father only has to touch a thing, as God incarnate, to set in process a series of events that will shape the world for generations. Here is the introductory biographical paragraph or two from Rahman concerning Nkrumah. Kwame Francis Nuia Nkrumah was born on September 18, 1909, in the small village of Nkrofu in Britain's Gold Coast colony. Early in his life, his elders identified him as having special mystical powers, but no one could predict that he would grow up to lead the first sub-Saharan African country to independence from European colonialism. He renamed the country Ghana. By this singular event, he proved to Africa and the world that under dynamic leadership, the seemingly unstoppable trend of 400 years of European conquest and domination could end for one small country. His actions became exemplary for the many other African nations suffering under the exploitation and misrule of Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, and Afrikanerdom. Nkrumah's teachers noticed his quick and precocious mind and chose him to teach his peers while he was still in his early teens. In 1926, a visitor from the Prince of Wales College at Achimota, Ghana, recognized his talent. He selected Nkrumah for higher education. It was at Achimota that he would come under the tutelage of James Aggrey, who introduced him to the ideas of W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey. In 1935, he gained admission to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania and secured passage to the United States. Lincoln was one of America's premier historically black educational institutions. During the course of the next 10 years, he received both a bachelor's degree and a degree in theology from Lincoln. He was ordained as a Methodist minister and earned a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania before being admitted into a Ph.D. program there. While in the United States, Kwame Nkrumah stayed in peace mission facilities on more than one occasion and frequently ate at peace mission establishments. He undoubtedly saw and heard Father Divine in those years and seemingly obviously took inspiration from Father's unionist ideas. In this section on Father Divine, Rahman writes, Lincoln University stipulated that its students had to vacate the campus during the months of the summer break. This rule forced Nkrumah into B. America during his undergraduate years, 1935 to 1939. Had Nkrumah lived with an American family, he could have remained stationary during the summer. Because he had no such sponsor, he had to fend for himself. This was during the Great Depression when jobs were very difficult to find for a native-born African American. Being a foreigner who spoke English with an African accent could only have made his travails more onerous. Nevertheless, Nkrumah had to go out and fend for himself in the United States. This compelled him to travel to different African American social milieus. He had to interact with the many different people of the African diaspora. His pursuit of the national myth and the personal tools for bringing about Africa's redemption would receive major assistance during his travels. Almost weekly and sometimes daily, the front page of the Pittsburgh Courier also featured often scandalous articles about the man of God whose followers publicly proclaimed that he in fact was God. That was Father Major Jealous Divine. Nkrumah stated that during these days he attended a lot of religious gatherings and revivalist meetings. Out of all of them, he paid the most attention to the peace mission of Father Divine. This was the only religious organization that Nkrumah actually officially joined. Nkrumah allows that it was for a strictly material rather than spiritual reason that he became a member of Divine's peace mission. Or so he finds it expedient to say. I personally cannot know for sure. Nkrumah wrote, quoted here by Rahman, I used to go round quite a lot to various religious gatherings and revivalist meetings. The only one that I gave much attention to was a movement headed by Father Divine, and then only because of the privileges attached to membership. By being a follower of Father Divine, I discovered that it was possible to obtain a good chicken meal for $50 instead of the usual $2 or $3 charged at other restaurants, and also a haircut at a certain barber shop for only 10 cents instead of $1. To an impoverished student, this was quite enough to attract him to any sort of movement as long as I could be fed and shorn at cut prices by merely raising my arm above my head and whispering peace. I fear I did not concern myself with the motives of Father Divine's group. Nkrumah only wrote about eating at Divine's restaurants. His laconic description did not capture the awe in which a newly arrived and hungry African would have stood in the midst of Divine's movement's cultural and spiritual dynamism. Historians of this period of Nkrumah's life have customarily followed his lead and given brief attention to his involvement with Father Divine's peace mission. Even the most sympathetic pan-Africanist historians have minimized Divine's impact on the future leader. And for his Marxist admirers, Nkrumah's adherence to any form of messianic spiritualism is incongruent with their image of him as a revolutionary. Conservative observers, such as Professor Henry Breton, simply ascribe Nkrumah's spiritualism to superstition. However, in the African epic, the quantity of influence that the hero ascribes to the spirit guide does not necessarily denote the actual quality of that influence. When Nkrumah's life and the story he wrote of it are viewed as an epic, images become clear and strongly suggest that Haarlem's messianic Father Divine deserves a more prominent place in the story of how Nkrumah became Ghana's messianic divine father. The assessment of this study does not challenge the integrity of Nkrumah's autobiography. It does, however, acknowledge that at no point when seeking to understand Nkrumah should a historian forget that Nkrumah wrote the autobiographical script of his life in the mid-1950s. He was then in the midst of political battles against both a Ghanaian opposition and the British Empire. Neither supported Ghana's total independence. Politics compelled Nkrumah to script his self-image as one that would strengthen his cause and weaken his enemies. For the Nkrumah epic to attribute to Father Divine, an African-American of controversial reputation, the credit he was due could undermine the hero's image of purity and infallibility. About the influence of Father Divine and other important personal influences, Nkrumah's autobiography serves as a chronological and contextual reference point. It does not always present the objective truth. When a leader and his supporters are not forthcoming about a particular issue, it is sometimes fruitful to review the words of the leader's enemies. That applies in this case to Father Divine's influence on Nkrumah. Colonel Kwame A. Afrifa was a principal participant in the military coup d'etat that overthrew Nkrumah. In his memoirs, Afrifa repeatedly attacked Nkrumah's character. After over 100 pages in which he intermittently denounced Nkrumah as everything from an African Hitler to a lunatic Garveyite, Afrifa summarized his denunciations by writing in his postscript, "In all these he saw himself as a kind of Joshua, and Father Divine and Cassius Clay rolled into one." In Divine's urban heavens and in his rural collectivist promised lands, Nkrumah witnessed for the first time how philosophy could influence thousands of people, B and W, to totally alter their lives. Divine's followers sacrificed their wealth, personal comforts, individuality, racial identities, and even their sex lives to follow the utopian communal teachings of a man whose propaganda proclaimed him God. Divine's movement was the prototype for Nkrumah's positive action, which was Nkrumah's adaptation of Gandhi's methodologies of anti-colonialist struggle. In the future, Nkrumah would launch Gandhian positive action as a series of protests and boycotts that would make the colony ungovernable and force the British to grant independence. Concurrently, Nkrumah would use Father Divine's techniques to wage spiritual positive action to overcome the spiritual occult supremacy of Africa's conquerors. Equally important to defeating European colonial hegemony in the temporal realm was to overthrow the legitimacy of W supremacy in the spirit world. Nkrumah's goal was to capture the Golden Fleece that would gain self-rule for Ghana, with himself as the warrior king who, like Jason, regained the kingdom. How could he galvanize millions of Africans to radically alter their lives, to sacrifice their wealth, their personal comforts, and their individuality to follow the messianic teachings of a man who proclaimed the imminent coming of a utopian African future? Father Divine's movement was the only example thus far where Nkrumah had personally witnessed a philosophy successfully implementing this model for social revolution. Despite his increasing admiration for the solutions of Lenin, Nkrumah knew that the Ghanaians were not Russians and would never countenance an atheistic movement leading them. Nkrumah would be impressed by Divine's successful techniques of motivation and leadership. The African Americans whom Father Divine motivated were the cultural and spiritual cousins of Ghana's peoples. Nkrumah's enemies were correct in that he did emulate Father Divine. They were wrong in attributing to him selfish motives for this emulation. He did not seek the Golden Fleece for egotistical vainglory. Nkrumah's imitation of Divine's methodology was simply a philosophical tool. It was a means to attain the ultimate end, to attain Ghanaian independence and the realization of the messianic vision of pan-African unification. The part of Father Divine's philosophy that was the most visible in Nkrumah's later behavior was Divine's messianic projection of an idealized utopian vision of the future with himself as the god of this common destiny. Nkrumah was not so much interested in philosophy qua philosophy. Nkrumah's interest was in philosophies that he could use to change Africa. In several ways, Father Divine's philosophy in practice provided important precursors to Nkrumhism. The later practices of Nkrumah's regime line up symmetrically with Divine's practices. Several authors have compared Nkrumah's social experiments with Marxian models and frequently used terms like irrational to explain them. Nkrumah did not measure up to the orthodox standards of their ideas of what a socialist revolutionary should be. They did not consider that Nkrumah's social experiments were carried out more in accord with the teachings of Father Divine than those of Marx or Lenin. Nkrumah's rationality returns after comparing his charismatic authority and social policies with those of Father Divine. The leader is both Messiah and God. His charisma surpasses that of all other mortal beings. Supporters and opponents must submit to his charismatic authority as they would submit to God. This leader's divinity is reinforced by the belief in his immortality. He simply will never die. Nkrumah never dies was a slogan of the young pioneers. According to the Ghanaian author, Ayi Kwe Arma, Nkrumah's regime tapped into superstitions and cultural propositions associated with the divinity of African kingship. He utilized them to construct in the Ghanaian mind an image of himself that would foster absolute obedience regardless of how corrupt and unpopular the sycophants who surrounded him were. I will interject here to say I believe the case is overstated for any idea that Nkrumah himself claimed to be God or sought to exercise the personal authority of God. But I do believe he wanted the Ghanaian people to believe that he was touched by God and instrumental to God. And indeed, perhaps he was. I do not know if this was a pretense or an actuality. Because of his contact with the living God, Father Divine, and because of the good fruits of his action toward furthering pan-African unity and global unity, anti-racialism, anti-colonialism, I do believe it is possible that he was instrumental to the cause of God throughout his career, even in the later years when he was protecting his revolution. However, if he was making claims and appropriating the powers of God unto himself for egotistical reasons, it would explain his downfall. Did he receive inspiration? employ it, and then get full of himself and overstep? Perhaps. Indeed, the Hebrew Scriptures are full of such examples. He wanted to be a prophet, and for most people he was a prophet of God. That God was his idea of the future of Africa. But people can't fill their stomachs with prophecies. Sam Nyako recalled a different meaning of this slogan when he was a young pioneer. Quote, "I never believed that Nkrumah would literally live forever. What we were taught was that his ideas would never die." Nyako did still recall, however, that some young peers so idolized Nkrumah that they actually believed in his physical immortality. Father Divine's movement was also based on an idealized utopian vision of the future that utilized some of the principles of socialism, but rejected some of the other basic doctrinal principles. Divine constructed an internal communalism within the peace mission and the promotion of a socialistic ideal based on the innate human capacity for utopian goodness. Nkrumah inserted this innate capacity into his concept of the African personality and conscienceism. When Father Divine implemented his philosophy of socialistic pooling of resources for the benefit of humanity in the early 1930s, he maintained a tenuous alliance with the Communist Party of the United States. The Communists then had a reputation for championing the rights of the in. Later, during the Cold War, Divine vocally opposed organized communism while maintaining his followers in communes in cities and on communal farms. Still, even during his most pro-communist period, he maintained a doctrinal distance from the Communist Party, whose Central Committee of leaders was primarily W. Divine did not become what was known in the vernacular of the times as a Red Uncle Tom, neither did Nkrumah when he ruled Ghana. Nkrumah identified himself as a Marxist and a non-denominational Christian. Father Divine set the example of the synthesis of Marxian communalism and unorthodox Christianity. It is the trickster's unorthodox doubleness that is important here. Prior historians have sought to attach a coherent orthodoxy to Nkrumah's Marxism, with Leninism being the most logical suffix. This has led to their overlooking or undervaluing Father Divine as a template for Nkrumah's unorthodoxy. This ambivalent and ambiguous relationship with official communism would come to mark Nkrumah's regime. Even though Nkrumah promoted socialist ideals contrary to his critics, he was no Leninist czar. One fundamental of Leninism is the Workers' Vanguard Party ruling through its violent crushing of bourgeois ruling class opposition. Leninism never stated that a socialist revolution could occur without the use of force. The wielders of this force would be the vanguard party of the workers. While in power, Nkrumah did not form such a party, nor did he seek to violently launch an orthodox Marxist-Leninist regime by extirpating his upper-class opponents. Nkrumah was also not a czar in the sense of Russian royalty. His royalty was that of an African philosopher king. To his followers, he was a special leader granted divine authority to change Ghana and all of Africa. Nkrumah would emulate Father Divine in attempting to achieve the revolution in the Ghanaian mind by nonviolent persuasion and not by the coercive commands of Leninism. Nkrumah would not abandon this position as long as he held power in Ghana, despite his sometimes labeling himself a Leninist. Nkrumah received his master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania in philosophy. Moreover, he taught philosophy at Lincoln University. He definitely would know that not non-denominational Christianity, but Leninism was the suffix for revolutionary Marxism in 1957 when he published his autobiography. He had made a conscious choice to synthesize two potent philosophies for the spiritual and political revolutions Ghanaians needed. More than this, these philosophies were external manifestations of his inner convictions. I am convinced that in the interpretation of history and future events, the will of God must be discerned. I believe that if he has any task for me in the future, this is the time for thorough preparation. Hence my detest for anything which might thwart this preparation. He would be a Christian and a Marxian socialist, despite the Orthodox Communist adamancy against this concept as oxymoronic. Had not their belief and their leader and God inspired Father Divine's followers to work on socialist-style collective farms? Nkrumah knew that Divine's lead and not Marx's and Lenin's would be more efficacious for the African Revolution. Hence, he ignored Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy to promote the syncretistic concepts that he would refine in the future into a philosophy that he named conscienceism. Previous historians have nearly unanimously insisted that Nkrumah first heard about collective farms in the Soviet bloc or Communist China. They attribute his enthusiasm to create communes in Ghana to his desire to emulate what he thought were successful operations in the communist countries. Unnoticed by biographers was Nkrumah's membership in Father Divine's organization and the lauded successes of Divine's communal farms. On Divine's rural New York and Pennsylvania communes, every race and social class worked without concern for personal profit. They sought solely to attract the light of their prophet's approval upon themselves. Like Christ's apostles, they owned everything in common and labored unselfishly to sustain and promote his ideals. Whether the ways and means of messianic leadership Nkrumah observed while in Father Divine's movement helped or hindered him cannot be definitively concluded. In the African epic, the knowledge or advice of a sage does not guarantee success to the hero. It simply assures that he will not pursue his quest without guidance. Sages in the African epic can be either good or bad. This impression often depends on the subjectivity of the observer. Outcomes caused by those sages can receive multiple interpretations. There is no record of Nkrumah's communications with Father Divine after his departure from the United States in 1945. Nevertheless, in 1957, the New York Times and Divine's official news journal reported that Father Divine sent a contingent of his followers to a demonstration in Harlem celebrating Nkrumah's coming to power. Divine also sent his Rosebud Choir to perform for Nkrumah at the outdoor reception. Rahman also writes, under Father Divine's tutelage, Nkrumah had seen every race in the United States live and work selflessly in harmonious and prosperous urban, economic, and rural agricultural communes. Father Divine had made the denial of racial existence compulsory for membership in his communal promised lands and heavens. Only Divine's charismatic leadership could convince W, B, Asians, and others to renounce and ignore their obvious racial differences, so-called, for a higher ideal. The physical differences between the Fanti, Nzima, Ga, and Yue were not as pronounced as between the races that Father Divine mesmerized. Pardon me if I mispronounce the relevant words there. Moreover, he had seen Harlem homogenize the diversity of the B-Atlantic into one people. It is understandable that Nkrumah would extrapolate from his false knowledge of the USSR and his African experience that he could build a continental movement unifying all linguistic, religious, and ethnic groups under the mighty banner of pan-Africanism. It is understandable that Nkrumah would extrapolate from his African-American experience that he could build a similar unifying movement. Nevertheless, even Nkrumah's worst enemies recognized that African unity was his obsession, even though they ascribed lower motives to his tactic. Pan-Africanism was the overarching purpose of his life. Nkrumah applied those tactics that he had already seen unite diverse peoples in the 1930s and 1940s toward achieving the goal of uniting the thousands of disparate African linguistic and ethnic groups. From New York to Philadelphia, Father Divine had united his multiracial following in their belief in his Christhood. B's, W's, Christians, and Jews were frequently not on sociable terms outside of Divine's peace mission, but inside his arenas of love, his heavens and promised lands, the Divinites became angels, and angels recognized only the human race. Each communal promised land was like an independent nation that he and his followers had liberated from America's historical hatreds. At the center of his combat ideology, like a hub holding together multidirectional spokes, was his personal divinity. Like the 12 disciples of Christ, his thousands of followers owned everything in common. This interracial communism led to repeated threats upon Divine's life by the Ku Klux Klan. Even so, Divine never flinched from pursuing his ultimate vision of creating an egalitarian society that recognized no differences in race or class. Sweet Daddy Grace, Sufi Abdul Hamid, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., and several others were prominent in B America during Nkrumah's sojourn in the West. Learning from all of them and practicing his preaching techniques in Be American churches honed his skills for the task he faced. Nkrumah believed that he understood the nature of African peoples, and he constructed his appeal to that spiritual nature. The traditional face of Africa includes an attitude toward men which can only be described in its social manifestation as being socialist. This arises from the fact that man is regarded in Africa as primarily a spiritual being, a being endowed originally with certain dignity, integrity, and value. It stands refreshingly opposed to the Christian idea of the original sin and degradation of man. Nkrumah, the ordained Christian minister, once again defied the orthodoxy of his faith, just as he had been doing since his childhood. He would not allow outer doctrines to overrule his inner understandings. A leader of such a movement could not be raised up by his people. Like other epic African heroes, he had to be divinely born for the mission. Long before Gandhi's birth, heroes like Nkrumah arrived in West African societies as agents of change. They used their occult powers to challenge and overturn the status quo. While realizing their divine destinies, they altered the destiny of entire societies. A member of Prime Minister Nkrumah's entourage attended a peace mission banquet on the evening of July the 30th, 1958, ADFD. The same edition of The New Day, August the 19th, 1958, ADFD, pages 18 and 19, record the remarks of Mr. G. Aka from Ghana at Circle Mission in Philadelphia. The guest speaker, attired in the multicolored robe of his native dress, was introduced by one of the Crusaders, Mr. P.H., as follows. Peace, Father, peace, Mother, and peace, everyone. Tonight we have with us a young man from the British Gold Coast, West Africa, which is now known as Ghana. I have known him a little while, and he has told me many interesting things about Ghana and about the independence that came to them after many years of being under British rule, and the trials and tribulations that they went through and how they rejoiced at their independence. As we know how Father always stresses what a blessing it is to have your independence as an individual as well as a nation. So at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Gabriel Aka from B. Ghana, which is about 8 miles from where Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the Prime Minister of Ghana, lives, and he is a member of the same tribe. Loud applause resounds as Mr. Aka rises, and with right hand raised high, he steps forward to speak. A portion of his speech is herein transcribed, as much as could be understood by the transcriber. Peace, Father, peace, Mother. I am so happy to see the movement in such a good way. I heard about the mission when I was at home. Many friends from my home who have been in the United States spoke wonderful about Father and Mother and the mission at large. Well, to bring a little light to you all, without God, we can never do anything. I am from Ghana, which is in West Africa. It is about 92,000 square miles with a population of 4.5 million. It was very terrible to struggle for our independence, and nobody but God could help us. Loud applause rings out. Before my great-grandfathers, we never knew anything about Christianity. That's a fact. Not until about the 15th century, I can say. The first church came to Ghana in about 1471. That's the Catholic Church brought by Portuguese missionaries, and they enlightened us in the way to have faith in God. Ghana at large, I can say, in Africa, is just like the Tower of Babel. Very hard for people to understand one another. Thousands of languages, dialects, and everything. But you cannot do anything without understanding one another. This mission effort is not because of Christianity alone brought in Africa, but also education in general. They educate us how to speak and write. We did our best to achieve it. We have not conquered the wisdom of God. We had somebody trying to lead us some time ago, mislead us. Why? By means of imperialism. And what happened? God lifted some wonderful person known as Kwame Nkrumah, and he has helped us on the way, and upon this man we are now free. Loud applause resounds. I remember we all gathered together, and he said something about Father and Mother, and I had never been to America. I was surprised. I heard wonderful things. Even when he spent his last penny, he was able to get a meal from the mission. They might not have been able to free us if the mission had not given help to him. Again, loud applause rings out. So in this case, I am thanking Father and Mother heartily in this way, that I hope that everything will carry on very nicely as it has been. I have so much enjoyed myself tonight, and one wonderful thing I have ever seen, which once came to my life, and has been lifted tonight to see a unique way to serve God. Loud applause resounds. And that kind of faith, we all need it to keep us up to date in life, just to see the Star of Bethlehem, which brought forth a light. Peace, Father and Mother, peace to everyone. Note that very important paragraph in this testimony, which testifies to the idea that Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was telling others about Father Divine. Quote again, "I remembered we all gathered together, and he said something about Father and Mother, and I had never been to America. I was surprised. I heard wonderful things. Even when he spent his last penny, he was able to get a meal from the mission. He might not have been able to free us if the mission had not given help to him. He might not have been able to free us if the mission had not given help to him." We thank you, Father and Mother Divine. Did God inspire and work through Kwame Nkrumah, planting ideas of union that will eventually come to fruition? Did he cloak secret devotion, or did he really reject Father's deity? Did he put himself in the place of God, taking adulation and authority that are not due any mortal, and fall eventually because of it? Did Father work through him because of past devotion, ongoing secret devotion he could not disclose, or in spite of himself? Surely the rhetoric and example of Father Divine were influential, the only American religious source Nkrumah mentioned in his autobiography. For whatever reason, Kwame Nkrumah wanted posterity to know about the connection. I personally believe he was forever uncertain what Father was or is, but was nevertheless contagionized and driven by ideas and world-shaping energies, catalyzed by Father Divine through such contacts into the collective mind at large. He did become a tool in Father's hands. It's all about resonant influence awakened from within, not control. Father uses all things and all beings. All things work together for good. A horse that does not cooperate will in some sense be wrangled. Father says he will put bits in their mouths and steer them in spite of themselves toward something better, but not so much controlling them as controlling their context and effects and who they are brought into contact with. Rahman uses a hero's journey framework to organize the biography of Nkrumah, placing his narrative in a somewhat mythic or archetypal context. He sees Father and Nkrumah as mortals, invoking culturally powerful symbols. But perhaps Father is the reality, and Nkrumah was inspired by what he observed in Father to play certain roles. Reality versus performance and imitation. Source versus ripple or shadow. One of the things that happen to heroes in the classic pattern is contact with holy beings, who may also be holy tricksters, whose intervention in the hero's life causes certain things to happen that become meaningful over time, not just to the hero, but to the hero's culture as well. Rahman suggests that Father Divine sent the Rosebuds twice, first in 1957 to New York City, but that may be a confusion with the 1958 event. As far as I know, the record is unclear on that. But even once for an individual politician was a unique occurrence. There is no other record of Father Divine extending such honor or recognition to any other individual politician. I find that very significant. To me, it signifies recognition of a spiritual bond and confirms the integrity, at least at that time, of Dr. Nkrumah. And Father's spirit caused the film of that day, stored away unwatched for 60 years, to preserve even a visual record. Father does proclaim again and again that he will get in politicians and leaders and political structures and turn them to his ends in spite of themselves. It is hard to discern where Nkrumah falls, except that his unionism is wholly in line with the plan of God to progressively unite the entire human race, all peoples, and every nation. It does show how God in history plants and nourishes certain seeds, whether by inspiration or reaction, that go on to be amplified by thousands and then adopted by millions. This single contact had and continues to have tremendous international impact. Here, Prime Minister Nkrumah is pictured with his wife, Fatia Ritzik, an Egyptian Coptic Christian bank worker and former teacher. They were married on New Year's Eve 1957-58, and they had 3 children. This was earlier in the year that Nkrumah visited Philadelphia. Like Father Divine, Nkrumah married across so-called racial, national, and cultural boundaries, and partly for the cause of human unity. Like Father Divine's sacred celibate symbolic marriage and the mortal marriage of Seretse Khama, Nkrumah deliberately married interracially. Note also in the various sources we have explored today that both Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah and Reverend Dr. Leon Sullivan were fed at Father Divine's tables at critical periods in their lives when they were students without much money, and both seem to have received spiritual nourishment that planted important seeds within them. There were many, many more just like them. Once Father Divine remarked out of the blue and uncharacteristically that he would like to hear some good jazz music. That afternoon or evening, none other than John Coltrane himself walked into Father Divine's presence in the Circle Mission Banquet Hall, sat down, played a few numbers, and then got up and departed without further word. It was not prearranged and transpired without a single spoken word being exchanged between them. Most of the people present did not know who he was, but I believe that God drew a sainted mystic of music, the best of the best, to fulfill his wish. As with Nkrumah and so many others, this brief moment of contact, almost lost to history, carries tremendous significance. Father's brief attention to jazz through the actual saint, John Coltrane, a saint of music, accepted, blessed, and infused an American art form with spiritual and culture-changing power. As a side note here, Father Divine also had correspondence with the person considered the grandfather of pan-Europeanism, the grandfather of the European Union, Count Coudenhove-Kalergi, named Richard Nicholas Igiro. Politician, philosopher, and pioneer of European integration, he served as the founding president of the Pan-European Union for 49 years. The Count's mother was one of the first people from Japan to immigrate to Europe, a fact no doubt contributing to his strong sense of internationalism. Sometime soon we will have a video featuring a letter from Father Divine to the Count. It is very interesting, however, that Father Divine personally contacted both the forefathers of pan-Europeanism and pan-Africanism. Here is one view of the beautifully designed mausoleum at Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park in Accra, Ghana, where Prime Minister Kwame Nkrumah's mortal remains rest. We thank you, Father and Mother Divine.